Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Cropper here. I'm getting over a slight head cold. You'll excuse me if I cough or sneeze just a little bit once in a while. This is the legal immigrant, and he's done a video here on the U.S. Constitution was not adopted to protect liberty. And I'm going to be listening to it, and I want you to listen along with me. So here we go.
To protect or enhance Americans' liberties. Now, most people in this country and outside this country, those who bother to even look into this, usually conflate the two. The American ideal of, a society where freedom is dominant is usually conflated with the Constitution. The Constitution is the thing that protects those liberties. Now I want to argue that that's not the case. In fact, if you look at how the Constitution was passed, if you look at the principles driving its drafting and adoption, the whole process of how it came to be that the U.S. lives under the Constitution now, even the mere fact that I just said U.S. lives, whereas United States used to be plural. You used to refer to a collection of sovereign and independent entities, states. In fact, we're using it in singular now as opposed to plural. That also came to be as a result of the adoption of the Constitution. So it's going to be a little long, I guess. I'm not sure how long it's going to take me. And I put together a few notes, so I'm going to be looking at them and as I'm talking to you about these things. So what I want to do is, first of all, when we talk about liberties, I want to define what those liberties are. And that should be pretty obvious to most of my subscribers. By the way, this video is probably not going to tell you anything new or anything that you don't know. Maybe a couple of interesting facts here and there, but if you're in favor of a stateless society, if you're an anarchist, then this is not going to be some kind of groundbreaking revelation for you. But I think this, and in fact, this is a result of an effort that I
have to say, I don't know exactly where he's coming from. He's been a viewer and a commenter on my videos a long time. I think he's some kind of objectivist, but I'm not exactly sure where he comes from. And you'll apologize, legal immigrant, if I don't remember exactly. I just have so many viewers I can't remember exactly what your story was. He's from Russia. Kommt aus Russland.
I undertook at a certain point to talk to some people that I know of a different persuasion. They're not anarchists, but they are generally open to the idea of freedom. And this was an exercise that I undertook, to try and convince them that things are not what they seem, in terms of the present American reality and American history, and other things. So I guess the market for this video, the best market for this video, the intended market, is really minarchists and constitutionalists and fans of the American idea in principle. Fans of the idea that the way to live in a society with freedom and dignity is to be American. Be America, or do what America did. And I want to make a case that that's not so, in a lot of respects. So anyway,
okay, there's a central case, I guess he's claiming, that don't do like America did. Is that what I get there?
Market for this video, the best market for this video, the intended market, is really minarchists and constitutionalists and fans of the American idea in principle. Fans of the idea that the way to live in a society with freedom and dignity is to be American. Be America, or do what America did. And I want to make a case that that's not so.
All right. Interesting.
So anyway, we're going to go over what liberties we're talking about. We're going to demonstrate the difference between the American Revolution as a concept and the U.S. Constitution, because the two are too often conflated, and that's a bad thing. So we're going to discuss the difference between Revolution and Constitution. We're also going to talk about what was there before the Constitution. How did Americans get by without the Constitution? We're going to talk about some of the central persons behind the drive to adopt the Constitution. What those people believed, what they did, talk about their ambitions, talk about their philosophies, and, views of the world, And I'm going to give a theory that I think is pretty well backed up by facts of the main forces and drivers that were behind the adoption of the Constitution. We're going to talk about the actual process. That's actually a very interesting topic that's not discussed too much, and I think it deserves much more attention than it's getting. The actual process of the drafting and ratification of the Constitution, that's extremely interesting, and I would believe that a vanishingly small percentage of Americans even know anything about how that happened, apart from the fact that it happened in Philadelphia and there was a convention. And we're going to talk a little bit about the opposition to the Constitution at the time. Then we're going to look at the new powers that the Constitution granted, the new central government that it created, and quickly look at the results of all that. And by the end of this discussion, I hope that you, my Minicus friends, are at least going to feel that you have a good reason to rethink some of the things you've been taking for granted for a long time. Okay, so I'm not going to cite a lot of direct sources. I mean, I'm going to cite some sources, but I'm not going to provide. This is not a scholarly article narrated as a spoken word. This is more a perspective. All of these sources obviously exist and they can be easily looked up. And if you're interested, contact me. I'll try to give you what I have in terms of links and books, that I recommend to read and so forth. But this is going to be a high-level overview, as it were. So, what liberties do we mean? We mean, I mean individual liberties. In my understanding, which is informed by sort of the Rothbardian perspective, liberty simply means the ability to dispose of yourself, your own personal energies, your body, and your property. So it would include owning property. To dispose of it as you see fit. Outside of you aggressing against similar freedoms of other people. That's liberty we're talking about. So, we're not talking about, freedom to kidnap, freedom to murder, freedom to rape. Because those freedoms, quote unquote, would entail, me or you or whoever tries to exercise them, would entail aggressing against freedoms of other people, freedoms and claims to live a free life without being molested by others. So we're talking about, just living your life, doing what you please with the stuff that you own, with your body, with your life, with your time, with your energy. Pointing a gun at someone to mug them is not freedom. It's aggression against the freedom of others. Freedom that they have a right to, I believe, not to be aggressed against, not to have a gun pointed at them, and not to have threatened by force and forced to fork over their property. So very, very, very simply, in the context of a political philosophy, it's this concept of liberty that I'm discussing is something that supports the idea of a voluntary society where the arrangements people make amongst themselves are voluntary. They're not backed by coercion, and coercion is not and by coercion we mean use of physical force or threat of physical force. The coercion is not used as a mechanism to achieve ends. And in that regard, we have to understand that.
So is this ultimately going to be a case where he says at some point there was this key where coercion was used to create the United States or something like that?
The power of government, the scope of the governmental power, is in inverse relationship to the scope of personal freedom, because government, as we're discussing it here, and I'm going to end up using the words government and state interchangeably. And that's not quite, very strict in terms of, if you're a philosopher. But for the purposes of this discussion, I think it's going to be sufficient. So government as we know it is physical force. Okay, law and government as we know it is physical force. Laws are not suggestions. They're not guidelines. They're not recommendations. They are enforced at the point of a gun. And when we speak of government, we speak of an entity that does the enforcing and also does the legislating. It creates rules. In our case, government creates rules and then enforces compliance with those rules. So that entity, that government, is physical force, plain and simple. When we have a tax code, that's not a set of guidelines, how much money you should donate to this entity called government. No. That's not that at all. Obviously, and if you want to discover that laws are in fact enforced at the point of a gun in a very, very literal sense, try not paying your taxes. Consistently not paying your taxes. Resisting the state's authority, resisting the state's attempts to extract that money from you. Just try to do that consistently. You'll see what happens. The guns are going to come out very quickly. you will indeed discover that you don't have a freedom not to pay.
Now, we don't have a freedom not to pay. True. On this thing here in Facebook, I said, what should be our priority, open borders or voluntary taxation? Way down, several days later, Jim Woods says, I guess to me, B, I'm Brandon, I think, B. Pardon me, stop. Just fucking stop already. The U.S. system of taxation is voluntary. See Jefferson's Rights of British America. See also the legal concept of agency. Okay. Now, that's going to push me over the edge right there. Okay? That right there is going to push me over the edge. Because I just about turned on the video camera the other day and said, alright everybody, the United States taxpayers are paying voluntarily. I just about turned on the camera and did that, and I thought, you know, I'm going to have to think about it a little more to make that case. I just about turned on the camera and said, the United States taxpayer voluntarily pays his contribution. Now, it's not true, but if what Jim Woods is saying there is true, the legal concept of agency is the key, then it is true. Because, first of all, you have the agency to move, right? To move from one state to another or whatever. And secondly, you have the agency to leave the nation if you really think it's that egregious. And thirdly, you can petition your representatives and stuff, and our taxes do go down. Trump just dropped from 35 to 21%, the corporate tax rate. So it's the case that our laws do change over time. So we have voluntarily gotten ourselves into the situation we're in, and we pay the taxes voluntarily, and we're not leaving the country because of it. So, in that sense, we do pay voluntarily, and Jim Woods pushes me over the edge here. Jim, I'm going to have to come right up and stand shoulder to shoulder with you here, because this is what I was about to say the other day, and now I come on here and I see this comment from you, and, you know, this is kind of in the grain of when I'm attacking the anarchists, and I say I don't even need to defend an objectivist state. I can just defend any state at all against anarchists, because it would be, like Yaron Brooks said, it would be better to live in Soviet Russia than an anarchist society. So you can actually defend just about any state of system and order when you're fighting anarchists. And that's starting to look like the case with this row about taxation being forced on us. You know, because ultimately my question is, alright, so we're paying 40%. What do you want to pay, 20? Or do you just not want to pay anything at all? You would pay for your own defense, right? I mean, you pay for the roof over your head. You pay for the car that you drive. You would pay, right? You're willing to pay, right? For your police and your military and courts, right? So what percent do you think is reasonable? 20? 25? 10? Like, is it an argument of that kind? We're paying 40% right now and you say we should pay 10? Like, if that's the argument, then I don't know if voluntary taxation is really our goal. I think our goal is to cut down government and reduce it and reduce taxes. Alright, so that's what I think about voluntary taxation inside the United States of America. If you live in Canada, you are screwed. I'm sorry.
And if you resist consistently, what's going to happen is, again, you're probably going to, have some letters first, and then, when you leave those letters without response for weeks and months, then they will start calling your house and trying to talk to you. And if you ignore them or just tell them, to go shove it, they're going to show up at your place. Well, they may not do that, as first resort. They may try and freeze your bank account from a distance, but eventually they will show up and they will try to take that property that they think is yours, your money. Let's say you've moved all your money out of your checking account in the bank. There's nothing to freeze. Well, then they will come for your physical assets to your place of living. And if you resist them then, because they will try to arrest you, put handcuffs on you, shove you in the back of a police car, and drive you off to jail. And if you resist them then, they will kill you. I mean, if you resist them consistently, imagine a group of people coming to your house. Um, you don't you're wrong. That's that's the institution we're talking about, the government, the institution that's allowed to do that. Again, this unnamed gang of thugs showing up at your house. They're we don't know who they are, but whoever it is,
We don't know who they are. They're actually known. They're publicly employed, known officers, and they have a warrant given by a judge for non-compliance with a law that was written by representatives that you either voted for or didn't vote for.
we think doing something like that is totally legitimate, and whoever resists them has the full right to do so. Not if they're wearing a uniform, not if they're have a badge clipped to their chest.
Oh, I see what he was saying. That if a random gang came up to your door, you could resist them, but you can't resist the uniformed gang. Well, because the uniformed gang has the backing of the laws that we all vote on. When every person up and down this street goes to vote, we vote in representatives who write the laws, and that's the type of law you're talking about here. We're not talking about some bizarre law that was foisted upon us. I mean, when Americans had a law foisted upon them, we had a revolution, and we said, okay, either you have our representatives there to talk about this law when it occurs, or else it's not a valid law. So taxation without representation was what we did the revolution over.
And not or to their belt, and not if they're waving a piece of paper that says arrest warrant on it. So that group of people, it suddenly becomes legitimate because people give legitimacy to government. Okay, government
Suddenly becomes legitimate. People give legitimacy to government. Suddenly becomes legitimate is a pretty quick dismissal of the Boston Tea Party, the American Revolution, and the Constitution of the United States.
in their eyes can legitimately take your property and do other things, regulate business, for example, tell you how you can and cannot do business.
Legitimately take your property. How much of that property would you have if you didn't live inside the United States of America? Now, again, I'm not really in favor of forced taxation, but I just think it's kind of a silly argument if we're arguing about whether we're doing 10 or 40%. Also, I think that if we had voluntary taxation, the government would be a hell of a lot smaller because they would have to operate on what we thought was appropriate to give them. But under the Articles of Confederation, they had voluntary taxation at the federal level, and taxes just simply weren't paid. The local governments had too much things to spend that money on, so it didn't seem to work there.
How you can and cannot dispose of your property. They collect real estate taxes on your house.
You say it's your property, right? You say, oh, well, this is my house. I live inside, and where do you live, Ohio or Florida? And you've got this house that you say is yours. All right, it is yours, but just defend it against Soviet Russia now because they wanted to take it. Or defend it against, the drug cartels. If you live down on the southern border in Texas, defend your house against the southern drug cartels. Now, of course, it's the United States that's defending your territory. It's the United States that's defending your house. Okay? You say it's your house. It's not your house in a vacuum. It's your house inside the United States of America. Now, you think ownership's important. I'll tell you something. The government you live under is important too, because you wouldn't have ownership like you would be a Russian-speaking communist if it weren't for the government of the United States. Soviet Russia would have taken us over if it weren't for somebody resisting them. Or maybe we would have shot them. Maybe the individual citizens would have. But if it weren't for the government fighting them and bringing them to a halt, then they would have gone a lot further. Now I know that they were equipped by us too. Now we're getting a little bit off the subject, but I just find this more and more untenable. This discussion of taxation as you want to set it to 0%, I think is the case. And now you're going to pay something though once we set it to 0, right? So that's where I wonder, what are we really discussing, and is this really just stupid stuff?
House. Do you think you own your house? No. If anything,
Yeah, call Russia and tell them, I own my house. This is my house. You can't take my house. Right? What about the governments that failed their citizens all over East and West Europe when Hitler called and said, I'll be taking all that property now, thank you? What would you do if you were there at that point? Say, no, you can't do this, Hitler. This is my house. Well, call your government and tell your government to get a bigger army and defend your nation.
You may think you own it, but if you stop paying property taxes, you will quickly discover that this property will be taken away from you in a way that the majority of the society around you believes is totally legitimate, and you will find yourself without a home very quickly. Or maybe not very quickly, but eventually you will. You will. There's no doubt about that. So again, government is force. We already discussed that liberty that we're trying to protect here, and we're discussing whether the Constitution does in fact protect it.
Government is force. Not only that, it's a monopoly on force. Not only that, it's the only monopoly. Right? There are no economic monopolies. We all know that. The only monopoly is a monopoly on force, and the only thing the government should do is force, and the only thing the government should do is its monopoly. So the word monopoly means the boss, the physical force boss.
Is that freedom from that coercion, from that force. So from that perspective, it's clear then that freedom includes and means essentially freedom from government. Maybe it's one of the most important aspects. Freedom from government is the personal liberty we're referring to.
That's ridiculous. The Greeks said freedom means obeying only the law. When the Persian king said, "Who is set as despot over the Greeks?" and someone in the court said, "Sire, the Greeks obey no man. The Greeks obey only the law." That was the discovery of freedom. Ancient Greeks knew it, and every society since then that does any good knows it. So freedom isn't just, okay, how did Rousseau say it? Man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. Were you born free? Are the bears and the deer out in the wild, are they free? Free for what? To be hit on the head any second and be somebody else's dinner with no retribution? And nobody to avenge them? That's freedom, huh? Nice freedom you got there.
So if government gets more freedom to do with you what it wants, then you have less freedom to do with yourself what you want.
That's a mix-up of the word freedom. What does freedom of government mean? That's bizarre. Government doesn't even exist. Only individual human beings exist. So the question is the freedom of individual human beings. The actions of the government is a category of thought, but the freedom of the government is just a mix-up. That's bizarre.
So they're in an inverse relationship. Therefore, if we can show that government powers have expanded, government powers over individuals have expanded as a result of the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, I think we have shown that the Constitution resulted in the diminishment of personal liberty. Okay.
All right, well, he didn't make a case there. That was a big assertion, but we'll see. Maybe he's setting up to make that case.
It was a long tangent and probably unnecessary for most of the people watching this, but bear with me. So, on to the next point. Revolution and Constitution are not the same thing. Not the same thing. They're often conflated in a lot of people's minds, and that's very regrettable as far as I'm concerned. They were accomplished at different times. The revolution occurred over a long period of time, but it concluded in 1783. 1783. And the Constitution was adopted in 1789 and fully ratified by 1791. So we had 8 years.
I think of it as 1787 because I think that's the summer when they wrote it. But then it went on being discussed, debated, ratified, published, talked about. But for me, 1787 is the seminal year of the Constitution. Now, maybe if I went over it, I would see it as a little bit later than that. But for some reason, 1787 is the year in my mind for some reason.
Years after the revolution had won until the Constitution was in place. And also, those two things were accomplished by two different sets of people. They were not the same people. The Revolutionary War was fought by the majority of the population. Now, not everybody. You had a lot of royalists, you had a lot of Tories, a lot of people sitting on the fence who only...
Now, the Constitution was discussed by everybody. These things were in popular discussion. They were the thing of the day in newspapers and stuff. states' rights and different things like this. The Federalist Papers and these things were traded back and forth, both privately and publicly. And some of these things were published in newspapers and stuff as articles under assumed names and stuff. You know, some of our founding fathers wrote public articles under assumed names just to get the ideas out there and to be discussing them with people and to get echo back from society of what should be our proper path. This went on for years. This was a beautiful, beautiful discussion that happened, and out of all of this came not only the Constitution, but more importantly, much, much more importantly, the Bill of Rights, because the Constitution's got a lot of really great stuff in it, and everybody said the Bill of Rights isn't really necessary. There were just a few people who said, well, I don't care if it's necessary, I'm going to stand by it, we've got to tag it on there. And so the Bill of Rights, a lot of people said that's not necessary, that's already assumed. All the things in the Bill of Rights are already in the Constitution. Now, is that the case, ladies and gentlemen? Because it seemed obvious to the people of the day that everything in the Bill of Rights, or most of it, was assumed in the body of the Constitution. Gun ownership was assumed, freedom of speech was assumed, freedom from search and seizure was assumed. All of this stuff was just built in, they thought, as the basic bones, and then the Constitution was built around it. But we outlined them in the Bill of Rights, and it's very, very good we did, because some of that stuff that they believed was just basic. Some of that stuff isn't even mentioned anywhere. So it's good that the Bill of Rights exists. There we are.
Joined the revolutionary forces when it was inevitable. Some people left. Some people left for Canada. Some people left for England. So no.
I've heard the estimate that 1/3 of Americans were on the side of the revolution, 1/3 were against the revolution, and 1/3 were just hanging out, trying to live their lives.
Not everybody fought, but by and large, I think it's safe to say that the majority of the U.S. population at the time wanted to secede and participated in the revolution and in the Revolutionary War.
I don't think it was a majority. I think it was less than half. I think less than half were against it, less than half were for it, and then there were a big chunk of people that were just farmers and didn't know and didn't fight in the war and didn't have too much to do with it and would have just got along in society whether it stayed Britain or became American, and weren't trying to make a big noise one way or the other just because they didn't know who was going to win. So
they actually wanted to secede, and they supported the activities that brought that about. The Constitution is a different story. There was no popular movement, grassroots movement, to adopt the Constitution.
There was a grassroots movement to discuss all of those ideas that went on for years.
There was no widespread public sentiment.
Wrong. The Federalist Papers is evidence of that.
Or a grassroots push of any sort. It was
wrong. There was Thomas Paine. There were all of the populist writings of the day. Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin, and a myriad of publications at the time.
Initiated, proposed, written, pushed through the convention by a very small, in fact, a really tiny and powerful connected group of politicians, lawyers, and elite businessmen of the U.S. Eastern Seaboard.
Virtually all elected. I mean, they were elected. Now, what does it matter if a small group of elected officials does something that everybody's been discussing for years, for a generation now? If you don't like it, we left the borders open. You can leave. It's not like Soviet Russia where you can't leave. So, it's not a slave state. It was actually done through public debate and newspaper articles and books and local libraries and debate societies and debates in our government, our legislatures, and the House of Burgesses. They debated and debated and debated and debated and debated. So, false, wrong, not true.
That's the fact. Again, not a majority or any sort of widespread grassroots push.
Wrong, wrong, wrong.
It was the very definition of
What was the Boston Tea Party if that wasn't a grassroots push? No, it was a grassroots phenomenon. And the newspaper articles and the discussions of the time and the intellectuals, the fact that people like Benjamin Franklin were popular intellectuals, shows that people of the day were interested in these subjects. They read about them, they talked about them, they thought about them, they debated them. And we have record of the debate societies and the goings on in our governments. We know about these discussions, massive amounts of discussions. Pardon me. I'll just alert you, ladies and gentlemen, to a very good book on this subject by Catherine Drinker Bowen called Miracle at Philadelphia. Now, she might be religious, and she may be slightly religious, and I don't think that it tinges the book that much. I don't think there's any problem at all that I can recall in it. The occasional mention of God or something, but not religious at all. Absolutely a secular book. Get it, read it, and appreciate what the world was like then, what the context of these men was, and how great their accomplishment was. A really great accomplishment to set these thoughts and beliefs and this culture of the day, which could have just been a golden age that just disappeared and melted, like Greece's culture, just changed, and then everything was gone. But they set this culture of the day, this beautiful culture that had come about and was revolutionary America, they set it down on paper. And we live by it to this day like a religion. We cling to, the last vestiges of it without even understanding some of the parts.
Special interest, if you will. It's a very small group, right? That created the Constitution, pushed it through, and made its enactment possible, and then reaped the benefits of it, as we will see. In fact, many...
Now, an upper class did pretty well by it, didn't they? And instituted slavery, didn't they? Now, how did that turn out for them, really, in the end? It impoverished the South, and then the South was crushed in a war that they had no hope ever of winning. 95% of armaments manufacturers was in the North. 95% of bank accounts deposits were in the North. The South had more debt than they had wealth. They were insolvent. They were agrarian. They weren't industrialized. It destroyed their society. So to the extent that some people tried to use the government to write themselves rich, it ended up being very bad for them, didn't it? And to the extent that we have certain things written into the Constitution, like the ability to coin money and control the money supply, that's bad. That needs to go. But that doesn't pollute the entire enterprise. That's like looking at Britain and saying that the whole of Britain and the whole of the British Empire is all junk and bunk, which it isn't. It's apparently pretty bad, because look at London today and look at what they've done with themselves. So obviously they're not able to defend themselves. They don't care to defend themselves. They hate themselves. They're destroying themselves. But aside from that, they did have a really, really great legal tradition. And anything that America has, we owe at least a crumb to Britain as thanks. At the very least. So, Britain, even though it's garbage too, also has very, very valuable things from Magna Carta on up. So, to dismiss America like this is very strange. Maybe this guy's an anarchist of some kind. Is that what he is? It strikes me as possible.
Prominent Revolutionary War veterans were passionately against the Constitution, which is an interesting fact, I think. There was a lot of opposition. Not enough, apparently, because it won. But there was opposition, and a lot of the people who fought in the Revolution were opposed to the Constitution for very,
Patrick Henry strikes me as one. Didn't he say that he could never support this horrific den of lies or something like that the Constitution had become? He really thought it was horrific. Now, what would he say about it if he could come forward to today and see everything that it's done and all the things we've accomplished and we're at the top of the world? He would say, well, yeah, still, but you should correct these things, right? And I agree with him. There's some real stuff we have to correct, but credit where it's due, credit where it's due. If there's 9 bad people on the stage and 1 good person on the stage, what good does it do to point to that good person and nitpick?
for reasons very similar to the ones that drove them to participate in the revolution in the first place.
Which, incidentally, by the way, I apologize to insert this thought here that's not really relevant to him and the things he's saying. But Amy Peikoff puts up a little meme that says, "Choose your bigot," and it's got a picture of Trump and Tlaib. And really, there's a whole bunch of scumbags who are trying to destroy America, and then there's a guy who puts his foot in his mouth all the time, but he loves America. Right? If you can't get your head around that, you have a real problem. You're an obleftivist. That is an obleftivist. I now have a list of obleftivists. Number 1, Amy Peikoff. I don't have number 2 on there yet.
2 years earlier. So, again, not a result of widespread popular demand, but it was a political maneuver by a special interest group. This is not a controversial fact at all.
Number 2, anybody who can't tell the difference between Tlaib and Trump.
Okay, this is not something that should even be argued.
Sorry, my thoughts are wandering on that subject. Let me back up 30 seconds and just make sure I follow whatever he's saying here.
But there was opposition, and a lot of the people who fought in the revolution were opposed to the Constitution for reasons very similar to the ones that drove them to participate in the revolution in the first place a few years earlier. So, again, not a result of widespread popular demand, but it was a political maneuver by a special interest group. This is not a controversial fact at all.
Well, I controverse with it.
Okay, this is not something that should even be argued about. This is a very clear fact. So let's not conflate the revolution with the Constitution. Revolution was not fought for the Constitution. It was fought for independence.
Neither of them were done in a vacuum, and they both were done by the same society, even though you may say individuals differed from one group to the next. But the debating societies, the intellectuals, the thoughts, the books, the newspaper articles, the thinkers, the philosophers, that was what that generation was obsessed with.
Independence and secession from Great Britain. Okay? And a different set of people, a number of years later, created the Constitution. So separate those two out in your mind.
Well, you'd have to separate them out in your mind if you wanted to divorce them and then come to conclusions that are bizarre. But if you realize that there was a 20-year period there that a generation did various things, including a violent revolution against the greatest empire of the day, and then writing down the laws that would make them the greatest nation on the planet, if you realize that generation did those things, not in a vacuum and not as a bunch of separate individual things that we can take apart and not relate, but as a related holistic event, if you look at it like that, then you can start to understand it. But if you cut these apart in separate events and say a group did a revolution and then a tiny set of 19 people sat in a room and wrote down the Constitution, if you look at it as two isolated events, you are going to be confused.
Now, what was there before the Constitution? Between 1781 and 1789, the 13 newly independent states existed in what would probably be best called a loose confederation under the first Constitution. Yes, the current federal Constitution was not the first Constitution. In America, the first Constitution was called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles did create a central government, although it was a far less powerful central government than the one we know and love today. For example, it couldn't collect taxes from Americans, couldn't raise troops directly, it couldn't conscript people. It could only requisition those things.
Now, I have a daydream that I want to come true. I want our federal government to have no power to collect taxes as such. I want them to be limited to collecting tariffs. I want the federal government to only be able to raise money when an American citizen can't find what he wants inside of our borders. If an American citizen can buy what he wants inside our borders, the federal government shouldn't take cognizance of it. But if an American citizen wants to buy something outside of our borders and support somebody else, some other factory somewhere else, then the government should say, could we have a little bit of this action here, please? Maybe 5% or 10%, something like that.
Both troops, so manpower, and also money from the state governments. It was, in that regard, a federal government. What it means is, if you're talking about a federal government, its subjects are not individual Americans. Its subjects were governments of sovereign and independent states. And when it demanded something, it couldn't demand it from Americans directly, it demanded it from the governments of those states. And now those governments had direct authority, taxing authority, other types of regulatory authority over the populations of their respective states. That's what a federal government means. What we have now is not a federal government in a strict sense. It's a national government, meaning it has a national scope, but it has direct authority over people. So it's not a federal government. The federation, as we knew it, is gone. It's dead. It's been dead for many, 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 many decades. Couple of centuries actually, almost, depending on how you count. So federal doesn't mean big or central. National means that. Federal doesn't mean that. And yes, the 13 states were in fact fully sovereign, free, and independent. Which, by the way, brings me to this big fiction of the American people. If you look at the time of the Revolution and the Constitution, there was no such thing as American people. There were 13 countries which had very different societies. And those societies were in different ways. Economically, culturally, temperamentally, even in terms of language, in terms of, diet and eating habits and, clothing. They were very different. They were very, very distinct political societies. With different ways of life, different dominant religions, and so forth. So in recognition of those differences...
Now, is New Hampshire different from California? Is Texas different from California? So I think built into this system is still a very, very large amount of difference. Is Florida different from Utah, different from Connecticut, different from Arkansas?
They actually hated each other's guts at times, and at the very least greatly mistrusted each other. Which shouldn't be surprising. I mean, look at the feuds that dominated Europe and its history for hundreds of years. You have people...
So whether this is good or bad, we built it into this system. This is evidence that the Founding Fathers built the culture of their time onto a piece of paper. And whether it's good or bad, look in Britain, they do have separate districts or areas or whatever, counties or whatever it is. But everything's London. It's all London. London is everything. Not in America, though. We have 50 different areas, and they are really, really different. They actually have a lot of local power about what to do. And some people are confused. They come to America and they say, for example, they say, I thought Prohibition ended. I thought, liquor was legal and stuff. They say, well, federal Prohibition ended. It's actually up to the states what they want to do, and there are some states or counties that have really, really strict liquor laws, and there are actually dry counties in the United States where you can't have alcohol. So,
peoples living next to each other for centuries and centuries and centuries, and hating each other's guts. Look at the Balkans. Look at Czechs and Slovaks. Look at Ukrainians and Russians. Although it's kind of debatable, but yeah, it's definitely there. To know them is to hate them, sort of thing, right? Just because people live on the same continent doesn't mean they have to like each other. And these people definitely didn't. In a lot of ways. They were very mistrustful of each other.
Yeah, we ended up having a damn civil war. It tore the country to pieces. We might have another. Do Trumpsters like Hillary cucks? I mean, when the Hillary people were crying and the Trumpsters were like, sweet, sweet tears. I mean, that's some kind of tension, right?
If you read about what the Yankees said about Virginians and vice versa, you'll laugh your head off. How incendiary that language was at times.
And incidentally, they did say things like, I love my country, and they were referring to the state they lived in. Like Jefferson said something about the sweetest thing in the world or something was his country, or something. Somebody at his time said something about that, and what they meant was Virginia, as opposed to all the other states, Massachusetts and wherever else.
But anyway, so I just want to make that point. There was no American people. That was not one people. Those were at least 13 different societies with very different ways of life, different customs, different views of the world, different views of government even.
And they voted on putting a federal framework over top of the whole thing and maintaining an awful lot of their local freedom.
Different philosophies and religions dominating there and so forth. So, okay, so the articles were there. What did they do? Well, they did create a central government with very limited scope of power because they wanted it that way. The state governments wanted it that way. They didn't want a central government with a lot of direct authorities over everything and everybody. But in the eyes of some people, that was too weak. It really couldn't do anything. Look, if you're serving in this government, that my impression has been that the Continental Congress and the government under the Articles of Confederation were sort of like an advisory committee. I mean, they could make recommendations and they could make demands, but those demands were not met with necessity every single time they were made. So they would requisition troops, and they could get troops or not get troops. They would requisition money, and they would get money or not, depending on whether the states wanted to. And that was how the Constitution was written. That was how the Articles were written. They couldn't force any state to do anything that state didn't want to do.
If I remember right, at some point they had $7 million paid in of 28 or 32 million or something. I can't remember, but it was some really strange number like that. And what happened when that was occurring was there was Washington saying, or it was New York at the time was the capital was New York. They said, hey guys, we've only got so much money paid in, and it was New York State that had paid. Nobody else had paid. And so all the other states were watching the other states to see if anybody was going to pay, because nobody wants to be the stupid one and send millions of dollars up to New York if nobody else is going to. And they were 13 different states, and why send it to New York anyway? We all know what Athens did when they had the Delian League. Are we going to do that over again, or is it just a replay of the Delian League? Why are we sending it up there? So they were very cautious about it.
To me, that sounds kind of nice, But the people who were in the central government were obviously not very happy. I mean, what's the point of having a position, if that position gives you little to no power to demand and have it be done, However, to those who say that was very weak, I'd say, well, it was strong enough to win a war. It was strong enough to enable coordination and cooperation between those 13 independent states to win a war and to earn those states independence. And by the way...
now, would it have maintained our freedom for centuries? I don't know. I'm suspicious, or let's see, I suspect that if we could have had a weaker federal government and let the states be stronger but still under the roof of a federal government, I suspect we would be even stronger and freer today than we are. So I think that those independent colonies were a beautiful thing, and we should have preserved more of that independence in our system. But having them scattered and not linked up definitely would be a dangerous thing. I think, because then Soviet Russia would have taken over Massachusetts for sure, and we'd have communists on. Well, wait, we do have communists in Massachusetts.
The King of England, when he released the states, acknowledged the defeat in the war and acknowledged the success of the secession, which we call the Revolutionary War. He listed those 13 states by name as fully sovereign and independent states. In the eyes of the king, he had 13 of what he used to think of as colonies of his crown secede, and they were recognized by him as independent countries, which is what they were. So anyway, weak or not, of course it was weak, but that was how it was designed, and that was why it was put in place to be weak. It wasn't put in place to be strong. And again, the widespread perception was that it was totally fine. You didn't have masses of people suffering because, solely because the central government was too weak and had a too small scope of authority over them. They were fine. There was no widespread popular movement in America to replace the Articles with anything different or some kind of new doctrine.
Now, by giving the central government a lot of power, I have to say, because some of you are going to hate this, some of you are going to just be mad to it, but I don't know who's going to really love it. Who can really love this, but I like it, okay? One of the first things they did when they got together a bunch of central government power was built a navy, and then they sent that navy over to fight the pirates in the Mediterranean. The wars at Tripoli and so on, and we still have that song that's the Army Corps song or something like that. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, or whatever. The tune's off, I'm sorry. And that goes back to Jefferson and the Navy that him and Adams built, and as soon as they had it, they started going around the world shooting at people. So I like it because they were defending. What was happening over there was the Europeans were paying the pirates, and Americans wouldn't pay them. And so the pirates were harassing and taking American ships. And instead of making a payment to them so they would leave our ships alone, we went over there and shot them all up and said, don't do it again or we'll come and shoot you up again.
Here. And they lived like that for 8 years, and everything was fine for most people. But obviously, for some people, it wasn't fine. And we're already getting an indication. I hope that it would be probably the people who had a lot of influence in that central government who would probably not be satisfied 100% with the scope of power they had, which was not a lot. So I'm going to give you a very, very brief account of a slice of the history at the time. So I'm generalizing a lot here, but my hope is to create a perspective for you to start, your own research and start reading about the events of that time from that perspective. So we have a group that I would call the centralizers, but is generally referred to as Federalists. Influential people that were unhappy with how the Articles came out. And they were unhappy pretty much from the start. And I want to single out Alexander Hamilton as the key representative of that group and the most influential figure at the time of that group. So as a young guy, Hamilton was a member of General Washington's staff during the war. He was his some kind of personal assistant or whatever. And there are indications that he was a first-class brown-noser. He really knew how to get close to people, how to make them like him, make people like him and trust him. Not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a fact. So he came to be pretty well regarded by Washington during the war. After the war, he got someone, I forget who it was, to introduce him to Robert Morris. Now, Robert Morris was one of the wealthiest people in the country, a very influential Philadelphia merchant, and he wanted to be introduced to Morris because he wanted a job. Now that the war was over, he didn't have really too many marketable skills, so he was a little worried about his career and what he's going to do for a living. Because he came from very humble origins. He was a bastard child of a family in one of the Caribbean islands, I think, and the family was. Well, he was involved in molasses trade, I think, as a very young man, growing up in the molasses business. But he wasn't rich. He wasn't independently wealthy in any sort of way. So he got somebody to introduce him to Robert Morris, this influential merchant from Philadelphia, and he wanted to position himself as an expert in finance. Well, he didn't know anything about finance, so he had someone recommend him a bunch of books. And essentially, he read a couple of finance dictionaries in order to be able to even approach Morris. And he read books, primers, and dictionaries to learn finance. Okay, he was very, very bright. That guy, I will say, he was very bright. So he absorbed a lot of knowledge, and he wrote a 30-plus page letter to Morris. 30-page letter, handwritten. Can you imagine? 30 pages. Jesus, he really wanted that letter to.
I just want to, if anybody remembers who this was, let me just give you this little anecdote. One of our founding fathers got onto a boat and he had a trunk of books. And the captain of the boat saw the books and said, who belongs to these books? What's going on here? Whose books are these? And he found out whose they were and invited that young man into the captain's quarters for dinner or whatever, and they dined. Was that Benjamin Franklin? Was the young man Benjamin Franklin? And I don't remember who the captain was. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe that's some other. Does anybody know what that anecdote is? Because I can't remember.
To be effective, I guess. So he wrote a letter to Morris in which he essentially said that he supported every single one of Morris's policy proposals and his views on finance and the organization of the new government, and so on and so forth. Now, Morris was an interesting figure. He was actually a pretty sinister figure. There's records of him making enormous amounts of money off of his war contracts during the Revolutionary War. He was part of the secret committee during the war, and he channeled gigantic amounts of money to his own merchant firm because he was on the committee. He was able to influence where the contracts went for purchase of war supplies, and he channeled them to his firm. And it was estimated that roughly $500,000, and at that time, if you take the price of gold as a rough measure to approximate what it would cost today, we're talking about $40 million in today's dollars. So he channeled $40 million to his own firm through.
Yeah, now I don't. This would have to be a discussion how to take care of stuff like this, because the federal government bought garbage for bullets. They bought rusty rifles. They bought. They would pay money for anything because nobody. It was just a scam. It was just kickback and unloading stuff into the federal government that has deep pockets and no accountability. So there's definitely a discussion of how we could keep things like that under control. They definitely are going to happen, and especially when you're spending $100 or $200 billion a year on equipment maintenance and replacement. Definitely people are going to take money and hand money around, and I would be happy if the only place in the economy where there was spending and government spending and government graft, was military armaments, police, and courts. And if we could then try to discuss how to get it under control in those areas. Right now we've got spending and spending and government graft in housing, in road construction, in education, in space. Now maybe we can keep space if it's military, but so I don't know if we're going to get rid of government graft like that. I suspect the best thing to do is have a free press and send people to jail if we can hold them accountable and stuff like that. I don't know if there's any way to ever get rid of that, because you are going to have the government talking to the government about where to spend their money, and I don't know how we're going to get around to that. One way I can see under a virtually voluntary taxation or highly voluntary taxation, tariffs only or something like that. If the government needed extra money, more money, extra stuff, if they couldn't make their budget, along would come Ford Motor Company and donate a bunch of vehicles for the police force or something, or along would come Boeing and say we're donating some fighter aircraft, 50 or 100 fighter aircraft, and all the maintenance for the next 10 years, all donated to the military. And they would put out commercials on TV and brag about it and stuff like that.
Cost plus contracts. Cost plus is an interesting, very interesting concept. It works great for defense contractors, where you basically, the government is the buyer, and they guarantee you, okay, so we'll cover your costs, and we'll guarantee you, a guaranteed rate of profit, basically. So you have no risk. You have no incentive to constrain costs. In fact, the greater your cost, the greater your absolute profit is going to be, because the percentage is fixed and it's a percentage of it.
Cost plus is a disaster, right, for the reasons he's outlining. But lowest bidder is pretty bad too, because you end up passing up the best project for a cheaper one. So
it's in your interest to grow that amount. So
the best thing the government could probably do is just buy one of each, huh?
It's a nice job if you can get it, but that's what he did. So he was essentially a war profiteer, a very cunning, very well politically connected merchant. So Morris received Hamilton and gave him a job. In fact, I think he financed his education. It's kind of like somebody meets a talented young kid in the ghetto, in the street, and puts him through Harvard. or Yale.
It might have been Hamilton and Morris on the boat that I'm thinking of.
Or something. That's what happened to Hamilton. Hamilton was very smart. He worked very, very hard. Was a workaholic by contemporary accounts. And so, long story short, the two of them became the leading forces in the nationalist movement. Again, the nationalist movement, the movement to install a national government, a government that's vast in scope, has direct authority over all the colonies, ex-colonies, now states, populations. So a central government, nationalist government. They were called the Federalists, right? They were calling themselves the Federalists, but the irony is they were actually set on destroying federalism as a system. They didn't want a federal government. They wanted to undermine the federal government, again, the government whose subjects are governments of independent states, a federation or confederation. They wanted to create a national government, a central government. So they were not federalists at all. They were anti-federalists. But ironically, as it often happens in history, they very cleverly hijacked the term. The people who we know as anti-federalists today were in fact true federalists. They wanted a federal government. They didn't want a national government. And the federalists were the centralizers. They centralized. They were the nationalists. They were the opposite of federalists. But oh well, we know them under that name. Now, one storyline that I choose to focus on is, has to do with moneyed interest around the time between the victory in the Revolution and the adoption of the Constitution. So I'm going to focus on that one story. I'm sure it's not the only story. I know it's not the only story, but I think it's a very interesting and instructive story, and it sheds a lot of light on the motivations of the people who were pushing for a central government. And to me, it appears to be kind of central to what transpired. So now, any war, is an enormous destruction of wealth, right? For one reason being, while armies fight, they're not working, they're not producing anything, but they're consuming, right? And apart from consuming food, supplies, ammunition, weapons, horses, whatever, horses get killed or die, or whatever, horses need to eat, blah blah blah. They're destroying stuff as well. As you're fighting a battle, you may end up destroying a town. Well, that town contains some kind of capital. That town contained houses people could live in, equipment to farm and to grow food and stuff. So all that gets destroyed. So war destroys wealth. And that was a long war, and a lot of wealth got destroyed. And it's physically gone now. It's gone. The wealth is gone now. What did the federal government, operating under the Articles, how did they procure all the resources that they needed to fight the war? Well, in different ways.
The troops at the Valley Forge had bloody rags on their feet. They didn't even have boots.
They bought it off the market. They bought it from people.
The market was poverty-stricken. There were virtually no goods available. These people were agrarian. They lived on farms. 98% of them were farmers. They had no factories. They had no manufacturing. They purchased all their manufactured goods from Europe.
Sometimes they took it by force. Sometimes it was a combination of the two, where they forced a certain price on people who produce the resource. Again, you need to eat. Your army needs to eat. Where are you going to get food? From the people who grow food. The army needs to be clothed. Where are you going to get clothes? The people from the people who produce clothes. Well, some of those things were taken.
Also, money was printed in some cases, and became virtually worthless because of that. Ultimately, these were the citizens of the United States fighting this war, so they brought their own muskets, and the citizens around them supported them. Ultimately, I mean, that's what. And it wasn't pretty. A lot of them died. It wasn't pretty.
Some of those things were bought. Bought with what? Bought with what? Well, the government needs to raise money in order to fight wars, right? You need to pay the soldiers something, although, the soldiers were paid. You need to pay for the supplies. Even though the soldiers are total volunteers, everybody just wants to fight, doesn't want to be paid. Although, if they were spending their time doing whatever they were doing before in the economy, they would be earning some income. So there's an opportunity cost to them being in the army. But even if we say that...
Yeah, they actually would go home for the productive season when they were needed, and then during the winter they would go and fight.
Every single volunteer is perfectly happy to forego that opportunity cost, just sink it. That's fine. They still need to eat, right? So the government needs to buy all this stuff for them. Buy bullets, muskets, swords.
No, they brought their own muskets. They sat around campfires making their own bullets. The government paid for. Washington had cannons and cannonballs, but the cannonballs were 3 inches across. They weren't a big deal.
Horses, buggies, and whatever else they had for means of transportation. How do you raise money for that? Well, the way they did raise money for that was by selling bonds, and we see that repeated in the U.S. history over and over and over again. Every time there's a war, they sell bonds. What is a bond? A bond is a promise to repay a debt, right? So the states issued bonds. The states, which were the entities that raised armies, which was then put together into this American quote-unquote army, because, again, remember, the central government had no authority to raise any armies, had no authority to tax anybody. States issued a lot of debt. So they were saying, okay, here's a promissory note that you give me $10 golden today, I will pay it back to you after, 5 years after the war is over or whatever. And that debt, any bond has a face value. And then the holder of that note may choose to hold on to it or sell it to somebody. And let's imagine a situation: somebody, you lend somebody money and you buy.
Now, one thing that happened in this instance was some of these were sold at 10% of the value. So people had put in 5,000, and then they sold them to somebody else for 500 at some point. And then after the war ended, there are these people who had bought all these things up for 500, and then the government's looking around saying, okay, who's got all those bonds? We're going to pay them back now. And everybody was pretty mad about it. They said, well, that guy bought a whole bunch of them for 500 each, and they're $5,000 bonds. That's not fair. So there was a big row about that.
A bond from a company or from a government or whatever, and then you have the sneaking suspicion that they may not be able to pay you back. So, for example, you may know that they don't have enough money to pay everybody who holds bonds, so they will pay some people, and others will go unpaid, or they will pay everybody, but they will pay less, a fraction of what they owe, some kind of fraction. So, but you want to get, if there's a risk that you may not get anything, you may want to get at least something for your trouble, if you can find a buyer for that bond. And the buyer gets the bond, takes the bond off your hands, and then it's up to them to go after the debtor and collect, if they can, right? What would entice a buyer to buy the debt? I mean, what if I hold a piece of paper that says the government, has promised to pay?
See, now I think it is fair. I think that the guy should have gotten paid. The people put their money out and then decided to run from 85% of their money or whatever, and just take a little teeny bit and take the loss and cut their losses. And that guy didn't necessarily know for sure whether or not the government was going to repay back at the end of the day, but he should have got repaid back.
But everybody knows they're going to have a huge problem trying to repay everybody. They simply don't have the money. Remember, that wealth is gone. It's gone. It's been destroyed, physically destroyed, annihilated through the years and years of war. How are they going to...
Well, the wealth has been annihilated, but it purchased the freedom of the nation. And now the government that issued those bonds is no longer beholden to Britain. It now has the power to tax within its own borders. So actually it can pay those bonds back.
Okay, well, we don't know how, but one thing is certain is it's much more likely that they're going to pay less than everything back on that bond. Maybe nothing, maybe a fraction, but it's not very likely that they're going to sell. That they're going to be able to repay the full fee.
A lot of societies do stuff like that. They borrow a bunch of money for war, then after the war they say, these companies were just trying to make profits on war, nobody can make a profit on war, and then they make a law against profits on war, and that means that those people don't get paid back. And in ancient Athens they had a way of doing it. They just said, rich people, how would you like to give a boat to the state and outfit it with a bunch of oarsmen? And the rich people said, why, yes, that's just exactly what we would like to do. Because if they didn't, then they would not be in good favors.
Face value. So people who were holding those bonds realized that the state governments are going to have a huge problem trying to repay in full. and therefore the price of the bond on the market, the price of those bonds, depreciated to the floor. They were trading at a few percentage points of their face value. If you have like a bond note from the state saying, the bearer of this will receive $100 back as a repayment of debt, if you think that there's only 1 in 20 chance that this will actually happen, or even if they pay you, they're going to pay you pennies, then the pennies is what you will be able to sell it for. So they were trading those bonds at like 3 to 5% of their face value. And some people, farmers who went back to their farms or were trying to, put their lives back together after the war, after the devastation of the war, many of them preferred to get at least something that was valuable to them at the moment, to get some capital to buy a plow or to buy a horse to rebuild their house or something, to get something back rather than just hold on to this paper and see it just depreciate into zero. So, there was a lot of buying and selling of bonds. The bonds were trading at let's say 5% of their face value. Okay, and large portions of those bonds ended up in the hands of a relative few, richer people. Most of them, or many of them, politically very connected people.
You could see how rich people would want to end up with those bonds, and not only end up with them, but end up with a lot of them, and then go to the government afterwards and say, look here, I've ended up with these bonds, let's make damn sure we get them paid off. Hint, hint, I'll be able to get you a little bit of money if you can make sure that these bonds do get paid back. Right? We could see that happening, right?
Ended up buying large quantities of those bonds. Well, now imagine you're a Massachusetts state government, for example, right? You have all this outstanding debt. How are you going to repay? Well, how do you get your money in the first place? By one method, and that's taxing people. So you're going to have to raise taxes. If you have to raise more money than is operationally required for your cash flow requirements, right? You're going to have to raise your taxes over what there are now to cover those outstanding obligations.
Or just borrow more, pay back those guys, and tell the new guys, hey, wait 5 years and we'll pay you. And when that comes, borrow more, pay them, and just roll it over. And I think that's the system they created. Not that it's a great system, but a better system would be to have a pile of money and use a little bit of it to run your government and keep a huge pile of money.
And those legislatures started doing exactly that. But the way they went about it was very regressive. And since the holders of the bonds were rich people, ended up being rich people because poorer people, a lot of Revolutionary War veterans who held the bonds, let go of them for at least some money in order to be able to invest that money into whatever home economy they had or farm or whatever. Now the bulk of the bonds was held by rich people. So you're not going to tax rich people to then repay rich people. It's just not something that makes sense. And legislatures in the states were heavily dominated by mercantile interests, basically property interests of the respective states. Most of them concentrated in larger towns, whereas the former holders of the bonds tended to be rural farmers, far away from Boston or Philadelphia or whatever, just working on their farm in the countryside. And there was no internet, no radio, no TV, so for information to travel would take time, substantial time sometimes. So taxes started rising, but they started rising on the poor. And backcountry farmers were hit the hardest in many events. And there was a lot of paper money circulating, issued by states during the war, but now the taxes they were demanding that the people paid had to be paid in hard money. It had to be paid in silver or gold or whatever. So you can imagine what's happening here. So you have rich people who bought those bonds for pennies on the dollar. Now they want to be repaid. The whole point of buying them was, I would argue, to be paid to get more for them than they paid for them, right? But in order to do that, the states need to raise taxes, and they will not raise taxes on the very people they're trying to benefit, the holders of bonds. Those holders of bonds would not allow it, so they raise taxes on whoever it made sense to raise taxes on, and that happened to be a lot of poor people, a lot of farmers.
97% of people were farmers?
Now, in addition to that, the truth of the matter is that a lot of wealthy people, including Morris, that I mentioned before, a lot of his buddies in Philadelphia and New York, were actually very fond of the British system under which they lived, and many of them prospered. System that we typically call mercantilism, state granted monopolistic privileges to connected businesses. And they wanted that system in America. Now, a lot of them, didn't start out being revolutionaries. A lot of them were Tories and Royalists, and they only switched when, the revolution was underway. But what they wanted though was not a laissez-faire society in America. They wanted the society in which they prospered before the revolution. Only now, they could, they were hoping they could get that system in America without the British. But the system they wanted was exactly the same. Now, this is in fact what the Americans fought the revolution against. The iconic event of the Boston Tea Party has everything to do with East India Company's tea trade monopoly that people were fearing would be installed on them. Okay, it wasn't just some weird event. The Boston Tea Party. They dumped that tea. They dumped that tea in the sea because the British were threatening to install the East India Company as a monopoly tea trader on the continent. Well, plus a lot of people like Jefferson, for example, they thoroughly despised the corrupt mercantilist system that the British operated under. So there was, another thing that we need to disambiguate and sort of unpack is the founders. The founders were not one monolithic group. The people who had a hand at forming the first governments and the legislative documents of what is now United States were not one monolithic group. There were a lot of different interests in there. And there was a lot of rivalry, and some of that rivalry was pretty darn intense. And the Hamilton-Jefferson rivalry is probably the central example of what I'm talking about here. So Jefferson despised the mercantilist system of the British Empire, whereas Hamilton was completely in love with it. Hamilton and his Federalist friends, and they were openly advocating for it. So from the very beginning, Hamilton agitated for what he called a more energetic government, more energetic than the anemic one that they had under the Articles, that would bestow privileges on his benefactors and his friends, and their businesses, and for that, they would, among other things, need to tax other people, to fund.
I don't know enough about what Hamilton advocated, but that sounds a little suspicious. He probably wrote himself in somewhere to the scheme. I don't know, but I have to give him a little more credit than that. I doubt he was that transparently cynical.
There are special pet projects, for example, and to pursue, again to quote Hamilton, imperial glory. He wanted imperial glory for America. He wanted America to become an empire, just as the British were a glorious empire. He wanted America now to become a glorious empire to rival the British.
Well, somehow a lot of Americans thought that was the case, and we expanded westward for the next 100 years. So
without the British, so British Empire Light, you could call it. So it would be a correct characterization, I think, to call Hamilton the founding father of what we now call crony capitalism. And in fact, his ideological disciples were the Whig Party, most noticeably Henry Clay, and what they advocated came to be termed the American system. And the American system had three main pillars. One is, forget about the pillars. That's not the point. Henry Clay, and then Lincoln, who's his disciple and in love with Clay's ideology. Forget all that. That's not what I'm trying to talk about.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to have to take a break because I'm losing focus on what he's saying here. So, thank you for joining me. Please patronize me if you support what I'm doing here. This guy's been interesting. I'm going to finish this. We're at 40, so we're exactly halfway, or almost precisely exactly halfway. We're somewhere near precisely exactly halfway in it, and we will continue this sometime soon, sooner or later. I don't know when. I have to take my daughter to the airport tomorrow. I might do some more later today. I might be a couple days. All right. And I'm also going to do, let me just tell you, I think this, oh, that's not it. Endeavor, it was his name. He has the Enlightenment that he wants to talk about. Lies of the Enlightenment 2, Consent of the Governed. He seems a little bit like, in this video, This is just a quick commercial here for my for an upcoming video. Endeavor in this video, Lies of the Enlightenment 2, seems as though he is a soldier in an armed camp, surrounded by sandbags and stuff, and he thinks he's in a safe armed camp, and all of a sudden he's getting shots from the forest into his camp, and he's scrambling to hide, but he doesn't know where to hide because he doesn't know which direction the shots are coming from, and he doesn't know where it's safe to hide. That's how this video feels to me. So look forward to that. And if you like what I do, patronize me and give me an excuse. It's nice when I see a new patron added once in a while. It gives me an excuse to really knuckle down and do some stuff. So if you like what I do and you haven't patronized yet, add $5 or $10 to my monthly thing and help me get built up. Alright, we're going to do more U.S. Constitution not adopted to protect liberty by the legal immigrant. We will be doing more of him soon. Thank you for joining us, ladies and gentlemen.